Welcome, listeners, to A Writer's Life. I'm your host, Heike Bohm, the author of the novel Secrets in the Shadows. A Writer's Life is a place where I'll be in conversation with fellow writers. We'll discuss all things writing. They'll read from their latest works, and we'll explore what happens beyond the pen in A Writer's Life. It's gonna be a page turner. I just know it. Pull up a chair and join us. I'm recording on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. Welcome, listeners, to another episode of A Writer's Life. Today I'm thrilled to be in conversation with Rosella Leslie. Rosella is an active member of BC's writing community, having served as a member and director of the Sunshine Coast Festival of the Written Arts. She was a founding member of the Quintessential Writers Group and has recorded oral histories for the Sechelt Community Archives. Her writing has appeared in numerous magazines and newspapers, including Western People magazine and The Leader. She writes both fiction and nonfiction and is the author of Driftchild, The Goat Lady's Daughter, Federov Legacy, The Cougar Lady, Legendary Trapper of Sechelt Inlet, The Sunshine Coast, A Place to Be, and is a co-author of Bright Seas, Pioneering Spirits, The Sunshine Coast, and Sea Silver inside British Columbia salmon-farming industry. Rosella currently lives in Sechelt with her husband John. Welcome, Rosella, to A Writer's Life.
Well, thank you, Heike. I'm happy to be here.
Where were you born, and what was it like around your dinner table when you were growing up?
I was born in Edmonton, Alberta. Didn't live there. I just was born there. My parents were living there for a while. Around our dinner table was very noisy. I was the third eldest in a family of 9 children. And so we had lots of siblings. It was very noisy, but we often had philosophical discussions. If any of us read a book, we'd talk about that book. It was a very noisy dinner time.
You're one of 9 children?
Yes.
Where do you fit in?
I was the third oldest, and I was the oldest girl, so I did a lot of looking after.
What were some of the early books that you read?
Well, I actually, my very first book was when I was 8 years old, and it was very memorable because it was my first chapter book that I finished, and I was so excited to have finished it, and it was the Bobbsey Twins at Cedar Grove. I read all the Bobbsey Twin books, and I just loved it. Couldn't get enough to read when I was young. We were living on a farm for a while. We were isolated 13 miles from the school and civilization. My grandmother had a summer cottage there. And in there, she had a cabinet with books in it, and it was a glass case. And I used to sneak in there and get out the books. They were way too old. You know, a lot of times they would not have been approved for my age group, but I didn't care. They were there. The only one I couldn't read, 2 that I couldn't read, one was the Bible and the other was Paradise Lost.
The story, the Bobbsey Twins. What was that story about?
Bobbsey twins, there were 2 sets of twins. There were 2 older twins, which were probably about 12, and then 2 younger twins, which were about 5 or 6, would move to different places. And this time they were in, I think their father was working in a lumber camp or something, and they were living in a lumber camp in the woods. And I don't remember the story anymore, but I do remember the one scene was they were in the kitchen. It had been raining outside, and they went to this woman's house, this older woman's house, and she had tea that simmered on the back burner, so it was really strong tea, but she put sugar in it for them, and then they sat and they were all cozy in this little kitchen with the stove and everything, and that image has stayed with me all these years.
Do you think the books that you read as a child influenced your writing today?
I'm quite sure it did. I always had an imagination when I was a child. I remember my mom showing me how to make fairy beds out of matchboxes, you know, the little matchboxes.
Yes.
You get. Probably today's kids won't know them, but
they were wooden matches.
They were
yes.
wooden matches. And if you put the match box up on end. You had a little covered bed with a canopy, and I'd put Kleenex in there or tissue paper in there and make a little fairy bed for the fairies at night. And I was always leading pretend games with my sisters and brothers, my little ones, and inventing characters. And I'd have elaborate characters. We just keep the same play going on and on and on.
Would you write the script?
Just made it up as we went along. But I mean, we did Robin Hood in the woods. We got, flour sacks, the Robin Hood flour sacks, and they used to have a big band. I would get totally into those games. And
some of your writing is about the landscape where you live and the people that live in them. What about that intrigues you?
Well, I love nature. I mean, my favorite can go for long hikes into the woods, and I love the shore, and I love nature. I find my peace there. I'm grounded in nature. It doesn't matter how troubled I am. If I go for a walk or a run or something, and I'm out there, I am restored somewhat by that. Yes, it plays a big part in my life, and I think because I moved around a lot when I was a kid. We moved frequently. And I found that while your houses changed, your your associates changed and everything, the landscape stayed the same. There was always trees, there was always water. It basically, you have different scenes, but nature is nature. And you can find it anywhere. Even in a city, in a back alley, you can find a little sprig of grass or something growing that's nature. And I love characters. I just love meeting different characters. The quirkier they are, the better. I love people. I did a lot of oral histories. I've done a lot of oral histories for the community, and I love people's stories. Everybody has a unique story. Everybody does. I can get totally absorbed in. I know when I walk by houses and I look at the windows, and you think there's whole families, there's a whole history behind those windows. There's heartache and there's happiness and laughter and love and all that taking place in that behind those windows. And I'm bursting. It's like looking on a trail and you're out in the woods and you see a trail going off and you want to travel it and you don't have time, but you got to walk by, or else it's private. It's got a gate over, and you think, oh, if I could just get through there and look at that trail.
Everyone has amazing stories, and it's just asking those questions and discover this internal world that we know nothing about. And as a writer, we get to explore that and pull that apart. You live on the Sunshine Coast, as do I, and that's how I know you through writing groups. Mm-hmm. How important is belonging to a writing group to you?
Oh, I would be lost without it. When I was writing before, but 1980, I had been living in Vancouver, and I had been on a career path, and then I decided that I wanted to write, so I cut my time down to half, and then I worked for temp agencies so I could start writing. But it wasn't working for me there, and so I went to Clohome Falls. I had a one-room float house to live in for 6 months and an old Remington typewriter. And I thought, I'm going to go write. And it was actually quite intimidating. When I first got there, of course, it's one thing to imagine going and doing that. It's another thing to wake up and arrive there on November 1st.
Sorry, Rosella, what year was that when you lived on the boathouse? And what made you even go live on a boathouse?
I thought, okay, how can I write and not work? I didn't have any money. And so I thought, well, if I did a house sitting job. And so I put an ad in the paper, and I got 2 offers. And one was for a lady in the British properties, and it was this beautiful house with a gorgeous view and everything. And then my sister-in-law said, there's this couple at Clohome Falls that's looking for someone to look after their float house for the winter. And I said, okay, I'll go do that. Well, it wasn't that easy. It was a big decision to make. Which do I want? British properties or this little float up an inlet where you can't even get to you can only get there by boat or plane. So it's like, and I didn't even know how to run a boat at that point. But okay, but there is an insanity gene in me, so I took the float house, and it was literally one room on a log float, and That time you did your business off a log. It wasn't. It was interesting. But got involved in the community up there, and it's at the two inlets that branch off of Sechelt Inlet. The first one is Narrows Inlet. It's 25 miles by boat from Sechelt Lowholm Falls, which is at the head of Salmon Inlet. Sorry, Salmon Inlet is first, and Lowholm is 25 miles by boat from Sechelt up Salmon Inlet. And there's the hydro dam up there. At that time, there was a 90-man logging camp there, and there was a hydro caretaker, and then there was an American lodge, and it was being cared for by this guy named John Alvarez, who helped me a lot when I was first there. So when I went up there, I had $200 to my name, a Remington typewriter, and a place to live for 6 months. I went to the camp and asked them for if they had any work, and the guy says, well, what can you do? And I said, I'm a secretary. And the whole office burst into laughter. I mean, what would the logging camp need with a secretary? I did eventually get a job cleaning. It was not my ideal of what I had gone through school for and whatnot, but never mind. It got me through. It supplemented that $200, and I was able to eat for a while. But no, it was an idyllic spot to write. I would sit at my table. And when I was first there, of course, I was overwhelmed with tiredness because, it's just such a new adventure. And I had a coal oil lamp. There was no electricity here. There was running water into the house.
At any point, did you go, oh, I wish I picked the British property house?
Well, I have thought over the years, but no, it was the best. It was the best choice. It was more me. It was absolutely me. I mean, it was very ideal. I wake up in the morning and there's this little, and I look out and the little golden eyes ducks are sitting there nibbling at the mussels on the float house, and they're having this little conference. It's like they're having this little coffee time. It was so cute.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So that's when I got a long way from the original question. Realized that I couldn't do it alone. I needed help. And I heard that Betty Keller was offering classes in Sechelt. And so I started traveling to Sechelt once a week to go to her classes. And I would stay with family in Sechelt overnight and come back. I'd hitch rides on the logger boats to get into Sechelt or whoever else was going in. And I get a ride. And I would go to Betty's classes. And when I attended that first class, I was so scared that I was shaking so bad. You have to read your stuff out loud, which is a very good way to see your errors, the error of your ways. And I was shaking so bad I couldn't read the words. I was terrified. And then when the critique came, even though Betty was very, very gentle with me, considering what I got later on, as you know, she was very gentle with me, but I was devastated. I was like, oh my God, I'm not a writer. I'm going home. I'm going to go back to work. But when you're a writer, you can't stop. That's just in you to do. And so I just kept on and on and on. And because of that group, I became better and better until I published my first story.
And what was that first story?
It was called The Stallion That Wouldn't Surrender. It was published in the Western People magazine.
Must have felt really validated.
I didn't know it was going to be years until the next one came along, but no, it was like, okay, somebody out there liked what I did, and actually that wasn't my first publication. My first publication came when I was 16, and I was living in a little town in Alberta, and there was a Father's Day contest on the radio. If you wrote a story about your father, you could get a prize. And the prize was a whole suit for your father from tip-top tailors, from top to bottom.
Wow.
And I wrote a poem about my dad and sent it in. It was the only poem I never kept a copy of. And I didn't actually hear it read out on the radio, but my teacher did and told me about it. And my dad won the prize. And it was my first publication. It was on the radio.
Do you remember the poem?
No.
Oh.
I know. But some radio station, probably long extinct in Edmonton.
That's great.
Yeah.
What was your first book that you had published?
The first book was Bright Seas Pioneer Spirits, history of the Sunshine Coast. And that was with Betty Keller. When I was working on a history of Clohom Falls, and Betty was working on her own history on the Sunshine Coast, and she said, "Why don't we collaborate?" And I said, "Well, I don't know anything about research, and you're so good at it." And she said, "Well, you will by the time you're done." Does that not sound like Betty?
Yes.
And so I did, as she taught me. She took me to newspaper archives and to UBC, to the UBC library, and all into the special collections, and we went everywhere, including Victoria archives. And by the time I finished, I was pretty good. I one of the things, if you want a little side story on that one.
Totally.
One of the things that I had was there was an American fishing lodge at Clohom when I went up there, but I had heard about a fishing lodge on Clohom Lake that was operating during the 1930s. And it had many famous people come in. They flew in by plane, and one of them was Errol Flynn and Clay. And I thought, wow, but I couldn't get any information. Nobody I spoke to had any information. And at the Sunshine Coast Museum and Archives, it was known as the Elphinstone Museum at that time, I found an old newspaper clipping about this guy, Marsden or something, that had owned property up there. But that was it. It was a little bit of his history. He had rented. Yeah, this lodge had been belonged to a guy named Al Taylor. And so I kept looking and looking, couldn't get anybody who knew Al Taylor. And then one day when I was down in Portland, Oregon, and I was interviewing a friend of the Ledbetters, because they originally owned the lodge at Clohom Falls. And I was interviewing them, and Ledbetter also owned the Port Mill and Mill, pulp mill sometimes. And I was interviewing this friend, and I said, "You didn't happen to know a guy named Al Taylor?" And he says, "Oh, yeah, we were friends." And I said, "You were?" And he says, "Yeah." He says, he lives in Vancouver. I said, "You mean he's still alive?" "Oh, yeah, I don't know his address." But so I thought, whoa, I was just so excited. So about 2 weeks later, I went to my sister's place in Vancouver, sat at her kitchen table with a telephone and the Vancouver phone book, and I went on all the A. Taylors or Al Taylors. I went through 60 of them, each asking the same question. I was at my sister's kitchen table with a Vancouver phone book and in front of me and a phone, and I would dial every number that had an A. Taylor or Al Taylor. And everyone I asked the same question: "Are you the Al Taylor who had a lodge at Clohom Falls?" And every time the answer was no, or really weird. On the 61st call, the man said yes. I was so stunned, I could barely think of the question I wanted to ask him. but he was very alive and very well, and he had arranged to go see him. And on the day that the Gulf War was declared, and that was in January 1990, I drove to his house and had the most marvelous interview, came away with pictures and the whole story of the lodge, and it was just marvelous. I felt like I had been given this wonderful Christmas gift in January.
Oh, I bet.
It was so exciting. I was just on a high for a week after that.
That's a really, really fun side story. Loved it. I kept waiting. So did you meet Errol Flynn? Was he still alive?
No, I think he was done. I think he was toast.
Oh, that's wonderful. So that was your first book. And you wrote about the Cougar Lady. And she was an amazing woman that lived here on the Sunshine Coast. Can you talk a little bit about her life and what was that research like for you?
Okay, well, I might deviate a little bit on that one.
Deviate away.
So while I was up at Clohom, I met the caretaker of the Clohom Lodge, the new one, and we fell in love and got married. One of his friends was Bergliot Solberg, and she used to come up, and she liked to hunt for bears up at the dump, and she would often come up and get John to drive her up there and bring her back. Well, this day John wasn't home, and she comes up from the dock, toting her rifle, And she says, "Is John here?" And I said, "No, he's not." And she says, "Oh, darn, I wanted to go up there. You couldn't drive me, could you?" And I said, "No, I couldn't drive." But I was intrigued by her, and so I started collecting Berkeley stories. And she and her sister were trappers and hunters, and they worked in logging camps. They worked. She worked as a whistle punk, and had a very colorful history. And everybody on the inlet had a story about Bergie, one way or another.
What year are we talking?
This would have been in the early 80s that I started collecting these stories, because it was shortly after I was up there. I married John in 1984, so there you go. Their stories so intrigued me that I was inspired to write a novel based on their characters, very, very loosely. It was not their story, but I ended up putting them, two sisters together up the inlet, and gave them a baby to raise. And so that story was The Goat Lady's Daughter. And that was the first novel that I had published. And that in itself is an interesting story, because I had written it and sent it out and sent it out. It came back. I revised it, sent it out again to dozens of places. And finally, I thought, I'm not touching it again. I love that story. It was my favorite story that I wrote, a book I wrote. But I put it on the shelf and said, that's it. I'm done. I'll move on, go to something else. I've done as much with it as I can. And about 16 months later, I got a letter from New West Press in Edmonton saying, "We'd like to publish The Goat Lady's Daughter." And I was like, what? I was like in shock for a week. I literally was in shock. And so this was in it was published in 2006. And Bergie had died in 2002, which was probably a good thing, because I'm not sure of what her reaction would have been had she seen that book. And it was a fiction novel, but she might not have ever understood that it was totally meant as a fiction novel. I continued to collect stories about Bergie and her sister, and then
How did you collect those stories? Did you speak to people that lived on the coast, or were there newspaper clippings? How did you come about these stories about the sisters?
Well, one thing living up in a wilderness area is that people stop, especially on the water, people stop in all the time. And so our living room, we had an open house all the time. You never knew who was going to come for dinner or sit afterwards. And they would sit in front of the fire after dinner and have a drink in there, and they'd tell stories of the inlet and everything else. And often the stories were about Bergie. And I would just scribble them down. And I always wanted to do a book, but I never quite got to it. And then Caitlin agreed to publish it if I wrote it. So I started to write the story, and then I did massive research. I had to do massive research, because the thing about getting stories is that they are often not accurate completely, and there's elements of truth in them, but I wanted to be accurate. I wanted to know. And where I couldn't be, I would just make sure that it was known as a story, not, but their whole story, their true story was fascinating enough. It didn't need to be elaborated on. And so I wrote the story about Bergie. I really admired her. I mean, I used to see her come in the wintertime with her boat, and her hands would be just swollen double, both hands with this, because of the arthritis in them. And she would be out there in that open boat in the cold, in the freezing weather, going to Sechelt to get hay for her goats or cocaine or whatever. And she'd haul those hay bales down the wharf, and into her boat, and then take them out to her place. And she had a real rickety wharf that would only float when the tide was in. So she'd carry it up that wharf and way up into the shed for the goats. And she was just, I just really admired her. She was a tough lady. And I really wanted to write her story, because I think she was one of a kind. And so I finally got it together, and Caitlin published it in 2014, and it's the Cougar Lady of Sechelt. It's the Cougar Lady Legendary Trapper in Sechelt Inlet. And there's other Cougar Lady stories that have been written, but the Cougar Lady was Bergie's name. It was her call sign on her ham radio.
Wow. Rosella, would you mind reading an excerpt?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Okay, this is a story that my husband, about my husband and Bergie. So, whenever you were dealing with Bergie, John Alvarez said, you had to be cautious. She was so determined to accomplish whatever it was that she had set out to do that you could find yourself in serious trouble if you didn't take the time to learn all the facts about what she wanted before you started out. One spring day, Bertie had an opportunity to sell her extra billy goat to a buyer in Madeira Park, but the billy was too big and too mean for her to risk transporting it in her boat. Instead, she called Alvarez and asked him if he could bring his four-wheel drive pickup down the back road to Carlson Creek and collect the goat for her. Reluctantly, he agreed. He met Bertie in Sechelt, and together they drove to Half Moon Bay and onto the logging road, which was just barely passable. As they neared Carlson Creek, they were suddenly faced with a steep mud bank that led down to a marshy patch of ground. They were still more than 15 meters away from the fenced area containing the billy goat, but Alvarez brought the truck to a halt. He got out, inspected the ground, and shook his head. I can't drive through that, Bertie. Oh, sure, Bertie said. I got some plywood. We can lay that down on top. He trudged through the muck, returning with 2 sheets of 1/4-inch plywood. Again, Alvarez shook his head. Truck will go right through that. Bertie wasn't happy, but she knew he wasn't about to change his mind. She had planned to put a nanny into the truck box and use that to lure the billy goat inside. That trick, however, would not work over such things. Reluctantly, she got into the truck and they drove back to Sechelt. The next day, she rowed across the inlet to Telecom Bay Marina and called Alvarez again. Oh, gosh, she said, I got a terrible time here. It turned out she had persuaded the owner of a small van to drive to Carlson Creek with her to pick up the goat. On the way, the van's transmission had been damaged, and when they reached the marshy ground, the vehicle became stuck in the mud. Sure, maybe you could come and give us a tow out of there, she begged Alvarez. Knowing his old truck was not up to such a task, he told her she needed a big tow truck. When she claimed she had no more quarters, he called the towing company for her, then drove to Telecom Bay, collected Bertie, and took her to Sechelt, where she met the tow truck driver. A week later, Alvarez spoke to Bertie in Sechelt and learned that all the time she had been arranging for the tow truck, the billy and nanny goat had been in the van that was stuck in the mud back at Carlson Creek. That rig wasn't as good as yours, she said. The tow truck had to tow us all the way to Madeira Park. Gosh, that cost a lot.
That was an excerpt from Rosella's book, The Cougar Lady, Legendary Trapper of Sechelt Inlet, the Sunshine Coast. What does a day in your writing world look like?
No 2 days are the same, I can tell you. I never know what a day is going to be like when I start out. Right now, I get up at 5:30 so that I can write in the morning, and I try to get my writing done in the morning. And then I either do work on my place, or currently my husband has dementia, so he's in a care home, and I've only now been able to get visitation rights. So I'm able to visit him in the afternoon some days, and 2 days a week I can take him out. So I take him for long drives. I take him for 3 hours, and we go for drives up and down the coast, stopping at beaches and places where you can see the water, and then bring him home and have a cup of coffee and a goodie, and then I take him back. So, and by the time that's done and evening comes, I'm wiped. So
I'm sorry to hear about your husband. That must be extremely difficult.
It has been a really, really tough journey. And you were saying about having writing support with writing community, which is very, I'm sure you found the same, that it's very supportive, and because nobody other than writers quite understands what a writer has to do. But a caregiver is also very alone and isolated, and the caregiver support groups are incredible for helping you through it. I would not have been able to get through. My husband has had dementia for over 12 years, and it was only just after COVID started that he went into care, so I was caring for him at home. And that's a really tough job, and I'm actually currently working on a book on caregiving to help share the things that I've learned. that helped me to cope. And one of them was the support group.
I can't even imagine what that would be like. I know, having had some earlier conversations with you, you took to writing poetry to cope with some of the issues that you have to deal with.
Yeah, yeah.
And that has been a really important part for you. Are you going to be publishing any of those poems? And would you like to share a poem or two about that?
Yeah. It's called Caregiving. I live in a place of lost objects, where plans are cast aside, and time is scattered like leaves upon the wind, where there is no reasoning, no tolerance for the one who needs it most. Now, he says, it must be found now, and I scream inside, I don't care, I don't care, all the while knowing that if I didn't care, I would not need to scream. There's one that I wrote towards the end of the journey. It's called Listening. Listening to footsteps on the stairs. Wondering, are they coming up or going down? Is it just a nature call, or is he about to head out for parts unknown? Reluctantly, I leave my bed and tiptoe to his room, where I find him snoring, safely tucked beneath his quilt. Relieved, I crawl beneath my covers and close my eyes, imagining the soft creak of shuffling steps, or the protest of a closet door disturbed too early. Afraid to sleep, so deep I miss his passing, I spend my night listening.
As a writer, it's always so nice that we have at least our words to express ourselves in the written word. Hopefully, it reaches other people and go, gee, I'm not in this alone, because it must really feel like, as being the primary caregiver, that you're on that journey all by yourself. And
you do. The loneliness is intense.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you've got people all around you offering to help and who do help, and you've got the support group, but there are hours and hours when it's just you and the person with dementia. My belief in the capacity for people to be kind has been restored. It hasn't been all bad. It is hard.
Yeah.
It's not all. And I have many things to be grateful for.
For more information on dementia, I have posted links below. You wrote a historical fiction, and I believe it was your first historical fiction, The Federov Legacy. What inspired that novel, and very different research? What was that like?
My first step into historical fiction. Well, I go back to another journey. I go back to my childhood, because when I was in school and studying history, it was so dry with all the dates that we had to memorize. And one day I found a book called Lord Jim, and it was all about, or I think, anyway, I'm not sure the title, but it was all about the Spanish conquistadors in Mexico. And I learned so much history from that book, and I couldn't put it down. I just read it, and I learned so much history, and I thought, that's how history should be taught, in stories. So I always wanted to write historical, but it sidetracked, and then finally I started on the Federov Legacy. It takes place during World War I, and it's two siblings from Canada end up in Russia during the First World War and throughout the Revolution and wars that followed the First World War. And they connect with two siblings from the Sechelt community of the Carpathian Mountains, which was under Austrian control when the story opens. And it's their survival through the war, and it did involve, it was over 2 years of research. It was very intense research, because it really matters a lot to me to have an accurate setting. The story might be fiction, but the details, the setting and the history is accurate. It's important for me to have that accuracy. So it was published in 2013.
Yeah.
And now I have a sequel to it. It was started as a trilogy, and the second one, the sequel to it, is called Galapova, and Caitlin is considering publishing that one.
So are you working on the third one of that?
Right now I'm working on the caregiver book. So
on the caregiver book.
Caregiving, yeah. So, and then I'll go from there.
Nice.
So,
Wonderful. So in total, you've had how many books published?
9.
Out of those 9 books, what book was the hardest for you to write?
The Federov probably was, because getting all that history accurate, doing all the research and stuff, it was a learning experience, and I really enjoyed it. But it was a big learning curve, and I really enjoyed it, but it was difficult.
So how was that research different than research that you did for your other books?
Partly because that research was local, and I did the history of the Sunshine Coast, that was here. Whereas the Russian one, I had to go to obscure sites and all sorts of places to find information. One of them, I managed to get a hold of connect with an old manuscript of, it was interesting because they never named the guy in the book, and it never found out the reasons for that. But they never named him, but he was the Queen's courier to the Tsar in Russia. He was there during the revolution and managed to escape, and he actually helped the Tsar's mother's jewelry out of the castle, smuggle it out of Russia for her. And I found his diary, a copy of it. It was published, but not under his name, and it was invaluable for giving me, a blow-by-blow description of what was happening in St. Petersburg during the revolution.
How did you find his diary?
I just keep looking and looking online. I go looking for sites, and one site connects. You know how it is.
Yes.
One site connects to another, and you just don't give up. You just, like those 61 names. That's the thing with the internet. You have to be very careful, because there's a lot of sites that aren't accurate. You have to check the accuracy of your site. You check. I mean, I don't just. There's a lot of reading involved, of course, because you got to read the material, but then you have to authenticate where it came from and how, and trying to find where that information came from, where that book came from, was really hard. But it was an interesting story when I finally got it. But it was and everything I got. All the material I got that I used in Federov was the same way. I just kept looking and looking. It takes a lot of time.
Yeah. Yeah, I found too with research, like I'd come upon something and I'd be like, wait a minute, I read this before, but the way they had posted it, they're omitting information. And by omitting information, it reads completely different, either supporting or against what you've just researched. And that became really interesting, because the more research you do, you're like, oh, I remember reading that article. Did you come across things like that?
I would find conflicting reports. One of the things that you try to find backup, don't just take the first piece that you find. It would be nice if you could.
Yeah.
I would have written the book in half the time. But you can't. No, you have to keep looking until you can verify what was happening. The beautiful thing is that there is a lot of material out there. It's incredible what you can find.
Did you at all work with a historian?
No, I did work through a lot of museum sites and whatnot, and so I got information that way. And there's a lot of European sites that I worked through, which, not speaking any other language other than English, was intimidating. But there's a lot of translations out there and a lot of material in English.
Thanks for those translators. Where would we be without them?
I know.
What sort of activities do you do aside from writing? And obviously you go for lots of hikes. Do you do anything else to help lift your spirit?
I love to travel, of course. I'm learning to kayak.
Nice.
I like to be on the water. And when my husband was still able to, we went fishing a lot. And we spent hours and hours up the inlet fishing.
What would you be fishing?
We'd fish for, when I fished, I like bottom fishing. I don't like salmon fishing because you have to keep the motor going. But bottom fishing, you turn the motor off and you just cast them out. And sometimes we would go up on the lake and do fly fishing. So I did some fly fishing too. I like to hike. I like to explore. And I like to take pictures. I like photography.
You have known, and I have known Betty for 11 years, and I know how important and instrumental she has been to my writing career and many other people. You've known Betty for a lot longer than I have. What has she meant to you?
She has been a best friend. She has helped me in so many ways, including coming in and cutting a sheet of arborite to put on my rental unit countertop one time. Literally, she did. I couldn't do it, but she did it. She's amazing. But as a mentor for my writing, I couldn't have gotten anybody better. I would not be where I'm at as a writer without her. Not only has she helped me to find publishers and whatnot, but she taught me never to slack off, never to just take the first draft. You just go over it, and you do it until it comes out right. And it doesn't matter how many times. That means you write it, even if you're grumbling and upset. You want to throw the thing across the inlet. You go back to it, and you go back to it until it's right. And I can't think of a more valuable lesson that she's taught me than that. She's a stickler for accuracy, and she has taught me to be a stickler for accuracy. And she's encouraged me. When I was down and didn't think I could go anymore, she said, "Come on, you can do it. You're a good writer. You go ahead and you do this. You can do this." So, I owe her everything.
Yeah, I know. Betty is so amazing. I remember basically she taught me how to write, literally how to write. And I remember thinking when I wrote my first novel that it would take me 3 years. And I had told that to Betty. I said, "Oh yeah, I'll have this finished in 3 years. Do you think I'll have it finished in 3 years?" And she looked at me across the table and she said, "It will be finished when it's finished."
Exactly. And that is it. It's like you want to rush through, you want to be done, but there is no rushing through with writing. You don't rush through.
Betty is wonderful, for sure.
She is the best gift the writing community could ever have had.
Mm-hmm. Very true. And I think all of us who are her students would agree with
and
that.
She's still helping me, so it hasn't stopped.
Yeah, it's true. I'm aware that you are also quite prolific at writing short stories. Would that be correct?
I don't know if prolific, but I have written something and had them published. I had a short story called Consistency in 2016 that won prize in Canadian Tales of the Heart. And then in the summer of 2017, Prairie Fire published my short story Stuck on a Rock. And that was kind of like my first caregiver story because it was fictional. But I was out fishing with John one time, and we would often stop to get oysters. And the way he did it, he would drop me off on the shore onto these rocks, and I would get the oysters, and then he'd come back because the waves would be too much to have him to the rock, stay by the rocks. So he would drop me off, and as his dementia got worse, it occurred to me one day that it might not be too smart to have him drop me off on a rock because his short-term memory was very limited. And it was very possible he could go away and forget that I was on that rock. So that struck my imagination, and of course I wrote Stuck on a Rock. Exactly what happens.
Thank you, Rosella. It was really, really enjoyable and fun to listen to your stories and adventures that you had with your fictional and non-fictional characters. I learned a lot and know a bit more about you, and I can't thank you enough for coming on and letting me interview you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, Heather. I love your podcast, and looking forward to hearing more.
Thanks, Rosella.
Bye-bye.
For more information on Rosella Leslie's writing, please check the links below. And while you're at it, why not subscribe to A Writer's Life? And if you want more information about myself and my novel Secrets in the Shadows, visit my website at www.haigabome.ca. For a kinder world, take care of each other.